The transit pod lurched, and Renn grabbed the overhead rail before the floor could meet her knees. The cable had not snapped. Not yet. But the anchor cradle at the upper station had sheared. She heard it in the quality of the groan that traveled down the line, a low structural note that said something load-bearing was gone, and the pod had dropped 14 centimeters before the secondary brake caught. Now they hung at 180 meters above the Veleth-Saar ice shelf, swaying in a wind that was already pulling the temperature readout through the floor. Outside there was nothing but gray. 3 passengers. 2 orcs researchers in the rear seats, pale violet 4-limbed academics named Rethavan and Chas, both gripping their restraints with the rigid stillness of prey animals, and 1 Velhari survey technician braced against the forward panel, which was Drav, and which was the point of view that mattered, because Drav was the one who would remember all of this and file the report and spend the next 14 months trying to explain a human's logic to people who had never watched one work. Saya stood at the door panel and ran her thumb down the emergency manual, not panicking, cataloging. The heat cells were on backup, 112 minutes at current draw before the interior dropped below survivable for the orcs. Velhari were rated colder. Drav gave himself another 40. The human had not mentioned her own threshold, which Drav would later describe in the report as operationally irrelevant to her, apparently. The beacon was transmitting. The problem was the weather window. Any rescue transit up the cable from base camp would take 9 minutes under normal conditions. Under the current wind shear, the lower station's secondary pod was locked in dock by safety protocol. The system would not release it until wind dropped below the threshold, and the threshold was 32 kilometers per hour, and the current reading was 71. Base camp is aware, Saya said. She was reading from the comm panel. Estimated window for rescue dispatch, 3 to 6 hours. Current interior temperature holding at 9 degrees. ORSE survivable threshold is 4. Rethavan made a sound that Drav's translator rendered as formal distress. Chas had stopped translating anything and was simply watching Saya with the wide fixed pupils of an animal that has chosen a reference point and will not look away from it. Saya closed the manual. She looked up at the ceiling at the maintenance hatch, the small access panel above it, and the rated load capacity stamped into the frame beside it. Then she looked at the emergency locker beneath the rear bench. "There's a descent rig in that locker," she said. 2-person, rated to 180 meters, we're at 180. Drav checked the locker. The rig was there. A pair of friction descenders, a spool of composite cord, 2 harness sets. "That is rated for 2 persons, Drav said. "There are 4 of us." "I know." She opened the rig and laid the components on the bench with the focused economy of someone who has done this kind of inventory before, not in practice, but in the back of the mind where preparations live. The cord was 190 meters. The harness sets were built for Velhari proportions. Orsi could fit with adjustment. "I can rig a second loop from the equipment tether," she said. "It'll hold. The friction descenders are the constraint. 2 of you go down on the rig, 1 on the tether loop. That's 3. 3, Drav said, and the 4th operates the mechanism from above. Saya did not answer that directly. She was already threading the tether cord through the door cleat, testing the anchor point. "The door opens inward," she said, "which means the lip gives me something to brace against. If I route the main spool through the overhead rail and backfeed the tension," she was speaking half to herself, half to anyone who could follow. Drav could follow most of it. The Orsi could not, but Chas had stopped trying. "I can lower all 3 of you on alternating runs." 2 runs, Rethavan said. It was the first thing he had said in 11 minutes. "The cord is 1 spool. You cannot haul it back up between runs. The friction descender can be walked back up the cord if someone at the bottom anchors the free end." Saya was fitting the first harness around Chas's torso, adjusting the chest buckle for 4-limb geometry. "It'll be slow, 12 minutes per ascent. We have enough time for 2 full cycles if we start now. That still leaves. I know. The wind hit the pod then, a lateral shove that scraped the chassis against the cable housing and sent all 4 of them grabbing for something fixed. When it passed, the temperature display had ticked down another ½ degree. The rig's anchored, Saya said. Chas goes first. Rethavan, you'll go second on the main cord. Drav, you're third on the tether loop. I need you to anchor the free end when you reach the bottom so I can descend the descender without a guide, just friction and weight. She paused. Can you do that? Drav looked at the cord. The math was obvious even without running it. If the descender had to come back up twice between 3 loads, the time was tight but possible. What was not obvious was the 4th descent, the one that left the operator above 180 meters with 1 cord, no guide at the bottom, and wind at 71 kilometers per hour. The 4th descent, Drav said. Has a higher error margin, Saya said. Yes, but I'd rather have a higher error margin than have one of you up here when the heat cell drops below threshold. The orcs won't survive that. Rethavan was watching her with an expression Drav's translator labeled as reassessing category. It was the look Drav had come to understand, that the orcs used when a prior assumption had been quietly demolished. Chas went out the door first, clipped to the main cord, Saya's hand steady on the descender's brake lever as she paid out line through the biting cold. The wind grabbed the cord and threw it sideways before Chas's weight corrected it. Drav watched through the door gap, one hand braced on the frame, and saw the small pale violet shape diminish against the gray and then land imperfectly, one limb catching the ice at a bad angle, correcting and signal up. 2 taps on the cord. Safe. 11 minutes to walk the descender back. Saya did not speak during those 11 minutes. She held the cord and watched the tension and let the silence sit. Rethavan went second. He was heavier than Chas and the pod swayed harder when his weight transferred to the line, the whole chassis complaining. Saya had braced 1 foot against the door frame and her back against the overhead rail, and she held, and the cord held, and Rethavan descended through the gray until the line went slack. 3 taps. Safe. Saya fed the descender back up. The motion was slower this time. The cold was inside her gloves now. She could feel it in the way her hands moved, slightly lagged, slightly wrong, but she reset the mechanism and turned to Drav with the tether loop in her hands. Velhari mass is higher than orcs, she said. The tether's rated to 260 kilos. You're what? 91. You'll be fine. It's not a descender, it's a free-fall arrest, which means you'll drop the first 8 meters before the friction takes hold. She was fitting the loop around his thorax. It'll be jarring. Brace your limbs inward and keep your head tucked. Once the friction engages, it's a controlled slide, 80 meters in about 60 seconds. And after I reach the bottom, Drav said, I anchor the free end. Yes, drive the anchor stake into the ice. It's in the rig bag I already lowered with Chas. She tightened the last clip. Then wait. Drav looked at her. Not at the cord or the door or the gray nothing outside. The 4th descent, he said again. Has a higher error margin, she said again. I'll be fine. The free-fall arrest was exactly as jarring as she had described. 8 meters of slack before the braided composite grabbed his mass and converted velocity to heat, and a burning drag that left friction scorch on the harness chest panel. The controlled portion was not comfortable. The wind had the tether oscillating, and the ice shelf came up faster than Drav had expected. But the landing was survivable, and Chas caught his arm, and Rethavan drove the anchor stake while Drav recovered his breathing. They looked up. 180 meters above them, the pod was a dark shape in the gray. The door was still open. The wind was still 71. The free end of the main cord hung against the pod chassis, anchored at the bottom as instructed, and after 30 seconds it began to move, Saya working the descender down the standing line without a guide below, using the anchor tension alone to control the angle. It was not elegant. It was not what the equipment was rated for, but it was working, and Drav stood on the ice and watched the shape in the door resolve into a person, and the person into Renn, descending at an angle that was more lateral than vertical because the wind had gotten hold of the cord and was not letting go. At 60 meters, the cord oscillated into a standing wave. The descender's grip stuttered. Drav saw it in the jerk of the line, and for 3 seconds the descent rate spiked before Saya worked the brake back and bled the speed down. At 30 meters, the wind gusted, a single hard shove from the northeast, and Saya swung a full 4 meters sideways, the cord going taut at the new angle, and Drav had a clear view of her face in the moment the swing peaked. She was not afraid. That was the thing Drav would spend the longest time trying to describe. She was reading the arc, calculating the return swing. Her hands were already repositioning on the brake lever before the pendulum momentum had finished. The return swing brought her back through center, and she let the rate build through the inner arc to kill the lateral movement. And by the time the pendulum died, she was 15 meters above the ice and descending cleanly again. She hit at 7 meters per second, faster than the rated landing velocity, faster than any of the 3 Odyssey-weighted runs before. Her right ankle caught the ice at 2 degrees off vertical, and Drav heard the sound it made, and knew immediately what that sound was. She went down on one knee. Both hands hit the ice. She stayed there for 4 seconds and then she stood up. "I'm good," she said. She was not good. The ankle was already wrong, the angle of the boot was wrong, the way she weighted it was wrong. But she took the 3 steps to where Drav stood, and she helped him pull the anchor stake, and she coiled the cord with both hands moving at the same methodical pace she had maintained for the last 90 minutes. "We need to start moving," she said. "Base camp is 3 kilometers on the ice. Odyssey can't stand stationary in this temperature." They moved. Saya moved with them, which was itself a demonstration of something Drav could not immediately classify, not bravery exactly, not the kind that announced itself, but the simpler, more absolute variety that did not check first whether the cost was worth paying. She moved with a slight deviation in her gait, her weight favoring the left side, and she did not mention it once in the 3 kilometers across the Veleth-Saar shelf. Rethavan noticed at the 2-kilometer mark. He offered to slow the pace. Saya shook her head and kept walking. Chas noticed at the final kilometer and fell in beside her without saying anything, close enough to catch her if the ice changed grade. She didn't acknowledge it. She kept her eyes on the base camp lights through the gray. They arrived at 14:42 station time. Wind was still 68. The rescue pod was still locked in dock. The medic team came out through the base camp door and went to Rethavan first, standard triage. The Odyssey cold threshold was the critical variable, and then Drav directed them to Saya, who was sitting on a supply crate near the entrance with her boot off, studying the ankle with the same expression she had used on the descent rig. "Fracture," the medic said, which was also what Saya had already concluded. "How bad?" she asked. 3 to 4 weeks with the regenerative brace, possibly 5. "I'll do 3, she said, and put her boot back on. Drav filed the incident report at 17:00. He spent 40 minutes on the summary paragraph, which was longer than he had spent on any individual section. The final version read: Saya Renn, Class 12 Origin, Survey Technician Grade 2. Engineered safe descent for all 3 non-human passengers from transit pod at 180 meters in 71 km/h wind shear using standard emergency rig operated non-standardly. Final self-descent conducted without lower guide, using anchor tension alone. Landing velocity exceeded rated parameters by a factor of 1.4. Fracture sustained. Passengers uninjured. She did not mention the ankle at any point during egress. The base camp medic team located the injury by directed inquiry. I have no category for what she spent on the ice today. The form provides for exceptional performance under hazardous conditions. I have checked that box. It does not feel adequate. She will do 3 weeks on the regenerative brace. I believe her.